chapter number 25, America Moves to the City. So still in the Industrial Revolution, but this chapter is looking at the culture. At this time, we see a growth of cities, we see new immigrants, see new colleges popping up, different social reform movements, the women's movement, literature, sports, all of that contained in this chapter. So let's look at the intro. First thing to note is the cities are a-boomin'. Between 1870 and 1900, of course this is the Gilded Age, we see the population in America double, and even within that we see the population in the cities triple. So we see a lot of people moving from farms to cities to work at these newfangled factories. And this is a growing trend not only in America but elsewhere, the trend of cities really booming. A big factor in this is America's agriculture. So America's agricultural revolution, which we'll see actually next chapter, starts to take effect. America is making a lot of food, and they're making a lot of food for cheap. So they're selling their cheap food overseas in Europe. So the poor peasants in Europe, the poor farmers, can't compete with all of this cheap American food being dumped into the European market. So a lot of these peasants have to move to European cities to try to find a job. So we see cities really growing all over the place. Moscow, Berlin, Tokyo, cities all over the world are booming. Section A, the urban frontier. So, like I was saying, cities are booming. In 1860, right before the Civil War started, there were 0 cities in America over 1 million people. However, by 1890, we see New York, Chicago, Philadelphia all passing the 1 million person mark. In fact, New York City has 3.5 million people, which makes it the second largest city in the world right after London. Kind of 2 developments that help cities grow. One development is this kind of invention of the skyscraper. Of course, with the skyscraper, you can pack more people into the same kind of square yardage. The first one we see is in Chicago in '85, 10 stories tall. And of course, along with the skyscraper, we get the invention of the elevator, because ain't nobody wants to carry a bag of groceries up 30 flights of stairs. The father of this newfangled architecture, or these skyscrapers, someone who's really known for this architecture, is Louis Sullivan. He makes them popular. Okay, and so the second kind of innovation that goes along with cities, besides the skyscraper, are kind of the creation of mass transits. So subways, electric trolleys, that sort of thing. People are now commuting. Back in the farm, of course, you'd wake up in the morning, you'd go to work just right outside your door. But now we see cities, we see mass transit. Chicago is the first U.S. city to get a subway. And like I said, a lot of different cities had electric trolleys, letting commuters go back and forth. Yeah, and really the cities were really seen as glamorous places. We see different districts. We see the industrial district, we see the business district, we see the shopping districts, and then we see different neighborhoods. People would go off of farms and then go into these cities, and cities had electricity, indoor plumbing, all of these new kind of modern inventions, and people were really attracted to this new urban lifestyle. And nothing really exemplifies this consumer economy we see as much as department stores. Okay, we have in New York City, we have Macy's. In Chicago, you have Field Marshalls. They create some jobs for women, but really they're a symbol of this new consumerism that goes along with this urban lifestyle. Back in the day, like when they had the Sears catalog and you would order your goods out of a catalog, those catalogs at first didn't even sell trash cans because no one needed trash cans. On the farm, if you got a hole in your sweater here, you would mend it. But now, if you get a hole in your sweater, you just throw the sweater away. Also, back on the farm, if you bought soap or any kind of goods, you'd usually buy them in bulk. But now you're living in the city, you're just buying, 1 bar of soap instead of like a whole bunch. So you have a lot more wrappings. So you have a lot more trash. We see just people really changing from the idea of thrift to consumerism. And nothing highlights that more, like I said, than the department store. There's a very famous book, and we'll actually talk about this book a little later on, published in 1900, called Sister Carrie. And in this story, it's the heroine. Her name is Carrie Meebler, and she escapes this kind of drab life on the farm to the kind of the dazzle of this new city. And really what awakens her desire for this more kind of elegant way of life are the department stores. All right. So with the growth of cities, of course, we'll have some issues. Some of those issues are, one, crime flourishes. People get away with murder, literally. Also, poor sanitation. People aren't showering, impure water, uncollected garbage. Of course, this is an era before the car, so we have a lot of horse droppings in the streets. Your book tells you that Baltimore had the reputation of smelling like a billion polecats. A polecat is kind of like a little ferret, a little rodent, so not smelling so good. And cities were really a sign of contradiction. You had the best and the worst of humanity. You had the very, very wealthy right alongside the very, very poor. You had these really polluting, horrible factories alongside these kind of grassy lawns of the suburbs. So a lot of contradiction. So let's kind of focus in now on kind of the worst, okay, the slums. Something that kind of symbolizes the slums are something called the Dumbbell Apartments. And you can look on page 599 in your book to see kind of a diagram of how these apartments were laid out. But more or less, they kind of had the name dumbbell because they look like a dumbbell. Each floor would have a number of families crammed in. They would be sharing one toilet amongst themselves. Each apartment only had one window, so very, very poor circulation. And a lot of times these dumbbell apartments would be in kind of rougher areas near factories. Notoriously, there was something called the Lung Block in New York City, and this was a residential area that was right next to these factories that were just puffing out smoke all day long. So people would literally cough their life away if they lived in the lung block. Other kind of places in the slums to know about, places called Flophouses. Flophouses are kind of like a hostel or like a really, really, really cheap apartment. You could pay a couple cents each night and sleep on probably a vermin-infested mattress. So not a lot of good conditions, but something at least was hopeful enough was a lot of immigrants who would start out in these flop houses, in these dumbbell apartment buildings. They were able to work themselves out of those conditions. So at least there was hope there. Well, rich and poor alike, you know, cities were sometimes very dangerous. Especially back in the day, before steel and brick, people were building out of wood, and they were building very close to each other. So, infamously, in 1871, we have the Chicago fire. 2/3 of Chicago is burnt down, leaving 90,000 people homeless. So really after the Chicago fire in 71, people start to think, hey, wood maybe not the best building material ever. So after this fire, people kind of learn the lesson, and we see a lot more brick and steel construction materials as well. Section B, the new immigration. All right. So at the height of immigration at this time, I think the year we had the most was 1882. We had about 2,100 immigrants flooding into America every single day. And now we kind of have two groups of immigrants to talk about. We have the old immigrants and the new immigrants. Old immigrants are people who have been here for a couple generations, people who maybe came because of the potato famine in the 1840s. So a lot of Irish, a lot of German. We had talked about the nativists or those anti-foreignists who really hated the Irish, really hated the German. But now, after time has passed, after the Civil War, during the Gilded Age, these old immigrants had really become accepted as Americans. But now we see a new group of immigrants, and these immigrants are different in the fact of where they come from. So the new immigrants are not from, Germany or Ireland. These new immigrants are from Southern Europe and Western Europe. So places like Poland, Italy, Russia, A lot of Jews from Russia, in fact, are coming over at this time. And by 1900, about 66% of all immigrants are from these kind of southern and eastern European cities. And they were a little different because a lot of countries they're coming from weren't democratic. And a lot of them had been really kind of just stuck in this cycle of poverty. So when we see the cities, we see a lot of times little districts or little neighborhoods where they cloister together or cluster together. So we have our little Italys, our little Polands. They kept their language. They're trying to keep their culture alive. A lot of them are poor, a lot of them illiterate, but they kind of group together, hoping that they can preserve their culture. All right, so section C, kind of magnifying in or narrowing in on who these immigrants are. So section C, Southern Europe uprooted. Okay, so the question is, why now? Why are all of these new immigrants coming? Well, there's a number of different answers for that. One, Europe itself was becoming, you could say, overpopulated. So you might ask, why was Europe being overpopulated? Well, it's simply because they were being fed. People were not starving to death. A couple sources of food. One, that cheap American food was being imported. And two, the potato, remember the potato originated in America, the potato is taking root, no pun intended, in places around the world. So we see people in Europe being fed. That means the population is growing, and it's growing too fast kind of for their own good. So we see kind of a lot of excess population, kind of put in a cruel term. So about half of the peasants that are displaced will end up in America, and the other half will go to other places. They'll go to South America, Canada, Australia, Africa, that sort of thing. So what was really the draw from these Europeans to America are a couple different things. One, we had the American letters. These are letters that immigrants would write back home to, you know, Aunt Susie in Italy, saying, Aunt Susie, you gotta come. They have the best everything. Come on over, Aunt Susie. And these would kind of spread, these letters would spread kind of American fever, and people would want to come. Another reason they came to America was the industries were recruiting them. The industries loved their immigrants because immigrants would work for near to nothing, and they needed a lot of workers in these new factories. So immigrants, or I shouldn't say immigrants, industry actually was recruiting from Europe. Another group that was recruiting were the railroads. They weren't necessarily looking for workers, they were looking for people to buy the land grant land. Remember, railroads were given so many thousands, if not millions of acres of land, and they were trying to sell that. So they would actually target immigrants from Europe. Come on over to America, buy this wonderful land. So we see kind of a couple different reasons why this new immigration. Another reason we see immigration, especially at this time, is religious persecution, especially among the Jews in Russia. If you've ever seen the musical / the movie Fiddler on the Roof, it's the same sort of thing. We see a lot of Jewish families being uprooted and persecuted in Russia, so a lot of them will make their way to America. And this group of Russian Jews was kind of unique from a lot of the other immigrants we see at this time, because these Russian Jews weren't necessarily farmers. A lot of these people had been in cities in Russia, so they already kind of had their urban skills developed. A lot of these people were shopkeepers or tailors, jobs that were already going to be flourishing in cities anyway. So that kind of distinguished them a little bit. And something to keep in mind, especially with the second wave of immigration, is a lot of these people aren't really planning on staying in America forever. We have people called birds of passage, like little birds. Birds of passage were people who came to America for a short time, made some money, and then went back to Europe maybe to start a family. A lot of single guys would come to America, try to make some cash, and then go back. So not everyone who came stayed. And like I said before, immigrants really try to preserve their culture. A lot of these immigrants, especially from Italy, are Catholic. So we see, once again, a boost to Catholic schools. We see Hebrew schools or Jewish schools. We see kosher stores, we see Italian dinner clubs, we see foreign language newspapers. People are in America, but they're trying to preserve their culture as best they can. So it's really the children of these immigrants who will really assimilate. It's the children who will go to school, become fluent in English, and a lot of times they kind of ditched or abandoned their parents' culture and really embraced kind of this mainstream American life. Section D, reactions to the new immigration. So Section D and Section E are both kind of talking about how America reacts to these new immigrants. Section D is kind of like the good stuff, and Section E is kind of like the bad stuff. So let's look at the good first. Reaction to new immigration, Section D. Well, here's the deal. The federal government really didn't do anything to help these new immigrants assimilate. So the national level, the federal level, we got nothing. State level, same sort of thing. States more or less did nothing. So it was really left up to the cities, the city government, to help assimilate these people, and the cities were, where would they even start? It was such a huge task. So kind of the friend we see of these new immigrants actually becomes the political machines. Political machines, for example, like Tammany Hall in New York City. Of course, they're corrupt, but they actually end up to be a blessing to a lot of immigrants because, they're willing to sell their vote for a city job. You would vote for the political machines candidates in exchange for social services. If you wanted a new park in your neighborhood, you would promise to vote for the political machines candidates. So kind of really the unlikely friend of these new immigrants are these corrupt political machines. Love them or hate them, they helped a lot of immigrants assimilate. Also at this time, we see the Protestant clergy really step up. We see this new intellectual movement among the Protestant clergy that'll last right until really through World War I. And what it's called the social gospel. It's the idea that it's the duty of Christians to help out the poor, which to us is like, it's a no-brainer. But alas, this was a social movement. A couple people you could know connected with this, the social gospel, I should call it, the social gospel. One was Walter Rauschenbusch. He was a German Baptist clergy member from New York. Also Washington Gladden. He was a congregational minister in Columbus, Ohio. So both of these kind of famous names when we're talking about the social gospel, the idea that Christians should really step up to help out the poor, especially the immigrants. Another group of people who are really working their hearts out to help these immigrants assimilate were women. Specifically, we'll be looking at three different ones. The first one, and probably the most famous one, her name was Jane Addams. Jane Addams was kind of from a well-to-do middle-class family in Chicago. She was the first person in her family, or first woman, I should say, in her family to get a college education. So we're seeing this kind of the first wave of women college graduates out there. And what she does is she buys this mansion in Chicago. The house is called the Hull House, H-U-L-L, the Hull House. And what she does is she creates a settlement house. So it's more or less helping immigrants any way they could. Free childcare, free classes in English. They would have programs for children to come in and kind of learn the culture of America at this time. So Jane Addams, definitely known for the Hull House in Chicago, but also very outspoken against war in general. So actually in 1931, she wins the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. Another famous lady connected with settlement houses, her name is Lillian Wald. Lillian Wald created a settlement house in New York City called the Henry Street Settlement House. And it's kind of the same idea, helping immigrants any way you could. And then finally, we have a lady whose name is Florence Kelley. Florence Kelley actually was a part of Jane Addams' Hull House. So she was based out of Chicago. And something she did is she lobbied the Illinois, Congress, or the state of Illinois, to pass some anti-sweatshop laws that protected both women and prevented child labor. So Florence Kelley connected with the Hull House, which of course was founded by Jane Addams, and she was really kind of pushing for some legislature reform, helping kill those sweatshops. So anyway, kind of this section ends by talking about women in the Industrial Revolution a little bit. We see women kind of stepping out and getting jobs at this time, especially people like Lillian Wald and Jane Addams kind of blazing the trail for this new career of being a social worker. But a lot of times we see when women are working, it really depends on their race to what job they get. So if you're a black woman, you're usually doing domestic work. So like being a nanny, being a cook, being a housekeeper, that sort of thing. If you were white, you would typically be, at least if you weren't a new immigrant, if you're a person who's been around for generations or a family who's been around for generations, a lot of those white women would get jobs being telephone operators, department stores, social workers, that sort of thing. And even within the immigrants, we see a lot of immigrants kind of cluster around different industries. For example, a lot of Jewish immigrants ended up working in the garment industry. And, you know, we start seeing women gain enough money, not completely to be independent, but enough money to, you know, go out on Saturday night and go dancing with the fellas. So we see this money creating some sort of independence for a lot of women as well. All right, so that was the good. That was stuff we did to help out the immigrants. Section E, narrowing the welcome mat. This is going to kind of tell us about what we did that didn't really help these immigrants out so much. Well, with this new immigration, we see a new rise of anti-foreignism, or nativism as it's called. And the nativists were really scared because they're seeing this birth rate of these immigrants are just going sky high. So they're afraid that they're going to be outbred, overpopulated, and also outvoted. So they were very kind of scared. Also, a lot of these immigrants, like I mentioned, weren't used to democracy. A lot of them had come from socialist countries, communist countries, even some anarchy within there. So nativists were once again scared that democracy would crumble because of all of these new immigrants. Organization we see rise at this time is the APA, or the American Protective Association. This is a nativist group with over 1 million members, and like I mentioned, a lot of these new immigrants were Catholic, so the APA was really against any Catholic political candidates. They would publish a lot of these scandalous stories about these not so wholesome nuns, that sort of thing. And something else to keep in mind too is the labor unions really did not like these new immigrants, and it's for a couple of different reasons. One, these new immigrants would work for near to nothing, so they would really kind of depress the wages of other people, really kind of steal jobs of Americans who had already been there. But also, these new immigrants were really hard to organize into labor unions, mostly because of the language barrier. So we see the labor unions not very happy with all of these immigrants either. So kind of the government's reaction to this is they start kind of narrowing in on the people who they actually allow in, kind of filtering people a little bit. 82, we mentioned this last chapter, I believe, we see Congress pass an act that actually stops all immigration from China. So that's specifically specifically kind of thinking about California. So they're cutting off all Chinese immigration. Also, we start seeing kind of a filter. So now they're not letting everyone in. They check to make sure you were sane. They wouldn't let in polygamists, alcoholics, prostitutes, people with contagious diseases. Even by 1917, there was a literacy test. So we're seeing really they're kind of filtering out the kind of people they let in. So famously in 1886, we see the Statue of Liberty being erected or built in New York Harbor. The statue was a gift from France, and the placard at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty reads this: "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores." So a lot of nativists read this placard and they're like, well, you got that right. You're just sending us all this scum from Europe. But keep in mind, right, we're historians here. We actually know this immigration was overall a good thing for America because the industry at this time was just starving for these cheap laborers, and also the cultural diversity we have in America at this time and even today is really a result of this new wave of immigration. Yeah. Section F. We'll just stop with one more section here. These next couple sections are actually talking about religion in America at this time. So Section F, churches confront the urban challenge. So the urban population, the city population, is a kind of a challenge, especially to Protestant ministers. They were used to country life, and they were kind of struggling with how to approach this new kind of culture, this new group of people, how to minister to them specifically. We see a lot of the wealthier parishes really taking their time in helping the poorer folks. A lot of the wealthier congregations where I'm at are sponsored by some very high up people. We see Rockefeller, right, the oil guy. He's really connected with the Baptist church. And we see J.P. Morgan, the Episcopal guy, really connected, J.P. Morgan, the banker guy, really connected to the Episcopal church. So a lot of these wealthier parishes really hesitate before they dive in and help out the poor. Within the Protestant clergy, we see this kind of new sect or new group of people, and they're called liberal Protestants. And what the liberal Protestants do is they really become active in this social gospel, like I said before, really willing to dig in and get their hands dirty to help out the poor. Also, on an intellectual level, what distinguishes them is they really kind of reject biblical literalism, so keeping or interpreting the Bible word for word. They didn't really see it as so much a scientific or historic book as much as a guideline to living a good moral life. A lot of their congregations would, well, let me give you an example. Dwight Moody, he had a church in Chicago, and he really emphasized not dogma so much as, fellowship, personal growth, forgiveness. So we're seeing this is kind of the Protestants trying to adapt to this new surrounding or this new urban culture. Also at the same time, of course, Catholic churches were just booming. A lot of these immigrants were Catholic or Orthodox, which is more or less a form of Catholicism. We see Catholics then actually becoming almost more prestigious. There's a famous cardinal. His name was Cardinal James Gibbons, and Cardinal James Gibbons personally knew every president from Johnson to Harding, because presidents like to make friends with this cardinal. Because if you're friends with the cardinal, you're friends with the Catholics, and you might actually be voted into office. So by 1890, if you're in America, you had over 150 different churches to choose from, different types of churches. We see a couple new churches kind of emerging at this time in America. We have the Salvation Army. Of course, we know the Salvation Army as the people who ring the bells outside of, Walmart during Christmas time. But they start really at this time. They start in England first, but in 1879, I should say, they come to America. And they actually recruit as parishioners the down and out. They do a lot of practical good. They do a lot of work with soup kitchens, that sort of thing. And then another group we see spring up at this time is the Church of Christ, Scientist. Church of Christ Scientists. And this also started in 1879. Mary Baker Eddy was the one who kind of founded it. And this church is unique because they really emphasized physical healings through prayer. So just so you know, when I'm talking about the Church of Christ Scientists, Mary Baker Eddy, physical healings, I'm not talking about Scientology at all. They're not related at all. Okay, so Church of Christ Scientist is not Scientology, just so you know. And also we see really the growth of YMCAs. YMCAs have been around since before the Civil War, but it's really during this Gilded Age that they take off. Of course, the YMCA stands for Young Men's Christian Association. And, you know, it's really growing leaps and bounds, combining physical education with religious instruction. And with that, I think we've had enough for this video.